David Carter exhaled as he turned onto Oakwood Avenue, the city skyline shrinking behind him. It had been another long day as mayor of Lexington, filled with meetings, press calls, and back-to-back discussions. His mind was already shifting to a quiet night at home, a glass of whiskey, a jazz record, and much-needed solitude. Then came the flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His body tensed. He instinctively glanced at his speedometer. 35 and a 35. He hadn't run a red light, hadn't swerved, hadn't rolled through a stop sign. His jaw tightened. Then why am I being pulled over? Still, he did what he was taught. Signal, slow down, pull over, keep hands visible. He turned onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. The patrol car behind him stopped, its lights still flashing. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out, adjusting his duty belt as he approached. Jake Mercer. Mid-30s, muscular, blonde hair cut short. His uniform was crisp, his movements slow and deliberate. David took a steady breath and rolled down his window just as Mercer reached the driver's side. "Evening, officer," David said, keeping his tone neutral. Mercer didn't return the greeting. "License and registration." David frowned. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Mercer's expression didn't change. "License and registration," he repeated. Suppressing a sigh, David reached for his wallet, moving deliberately as he retrieved his driver's license and the car's registration. No sudden movements. He knew how easily these situations could turn. Mercer took the documents, giving them a brief glance before slipping them into his pocket. "You were hugging the center line back there," Mercer said, "just making sure everything's in order." David blinked. "The center line?" He glanced at the road, completely empty. "That's not a violation." Mercer ignored the comment. His gaze flicked toward the passenger seat. "You got anything in the car I should know about?" David kept his face impassive. "Just some groceries in my gym bag." Mercer nodded toward the door. "Step out of the vehicle." David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Is that necessary?" "Not a request," Mercer said. David knew the game. He could push back, ask for a supervisor, demand an explanation, but that wouldn't end well. With controlled patience, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out. Mercer wasted no time. He patted him down roughly, hands pressing against his pockets, his sleeves, his belt. "Spread your feet," Mercer muttered. David complied, inhaling deeply to keep his composure. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but frustration. He'd done nothing wrong. Mercer stepped back, eyes still scanning him. "Pop the trunk." David hesitated. "Unless you have probable cause." "You got something to hide?" Mercer cut in, tilting his head. His smirk was slight, but unmistakable. David clenched his jaw, then reached for his key fob and unlocked the trunk. Inside, exactly what he said. Brown grocery bags, a black duffel bag. Mercer rummaged through the bags with little care, pushing things aside. Milk, cereal, a pack of bottled water. Then he unzipped the duffel bag. Gym clothes, sneakers, a towel. Mercer straightened, looking almost disappointed. "Well, would you look at that," he muttered. "Nothing illegal." David exhaled slowly, regaining control of his irritation. "Am I free to go now?" Mercer shut the trunk with a loud slam. "Not quite. Need to run a check first." David's patience was running thin. "On what grounds?" Mercer didn't answer. He was already walking back to his patrol car. David stood by the roadside, the flashing lights painting his skin in red and blue. A few pedestrians had stopped on the sidewalk, watching quietly. None spoke up. He glanced at his watch. 7 minutes had passed. His attention shifted back to Mercer, who was staring at the screen inside his patrol car. His face had changed, no longer smug, no longer indifferent. David narrowed his eyes. "He knows who I am now." David stood by the curb, his breath steady despite the frustration simmering beneath his skin. The street was quiet except for the hum of Mercer's patrol car, its flashing lights still casting a rhythmic glow over the pavement. He glanced at his watch. 12 minutes had passed. This was no routine stop. Across the street, a few pedestrians had gathered, watching with cautious curiosity. A woman clutched her phone, likely recording. David turned back toward Mercer, who was still in his car, eyes locked on the glowing screen in front of him. His fingers drummed against the dashboard. His expression had changed. Tension where there had been arrogance. Hesitation where there had been certainty. He knows. The realization settled over David like a weight. Mercer had just discovered exactly who he had pulled over, the mayor of Lexington. Yet instead of getting out and apologizing, Mercer stayed in the car, his jaw tight, his grip on the wheel rigid, calculating. David knew that look, the look of a man deciding whether to admit a mistake or double down on it. A full minute passed before Mercer finally stepped out. His posture was stiffer, but his voice betrayed nothing. "Sir, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." David's chest tightened. "Excuse me?" Mercer held up his handcuffs. "There's an issue with your record. You're being detained for further questioning." David let out a slow breath. He could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about power. Mercer had seen his name, and instead of backing down, he had decided to push forward. "You and I both know that's not true," David said evenly. Mercer stepped closer. "Turn around." David had two choices. He could argue, demand a supervisor, refuse. But that would only escalate things. And with no other officers around yet, it was Mercer's word against his. With controlled patience, David turned around and placed his hands behind his back. The cold bite of metal snapped around his wrists. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The woman with the phone raised it higher. Mercer grabbed his arm and guided him toward the patrol car. "Watch your head," he said, as if this were just another arrest. David ducked into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind him. The ride was silent. No sirens, no radio chatter. Just the soft hum of the engine as Mercer gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. David sat still, his breathing even. He wasn't afraid. He was furious. As they pulled up to the Lexington Police Department, the station was alive with movement. Officers coming and going, dispatchers fielding calls, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over everything. Mercer led David inside past the reception desk. A female officer, Sergeant Karen Alvarez, raised an eyebrow as they approached. "Mercer, what's this?" she asked, glancing between them. "Bringing him in for questioning," Mercer said, his grip firm on David's arm. Alvarez frowned. "For what?" "Suspicion of illegal activity," Mercer muttered, already moving toward the booking area. That caught everyone's attention. Conversation slowed. A few officers turned in their chairs. Before Mercer could take another step, a voice rang out. "Wait a second." A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s stepped forward. Lieutenant Ray Daniels. Stern face, graying hair. The kind of presence that commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. Daniels scanned David's face, then turned to Mercer, eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" Mercer squared his shoulders. "Routine stop." The subject had discrepancies in his record. David, still handcuffed, let out a dry chuckle. "The subject?" Daniels gave Mercer a long, measured look before turning toward Sergeant Alvarez. "Run his ID," he said. Alvarez was already ahead of him. She typed into her computer, eyes flicking between the screen and David. Within seconds, her expression changed. She looked up at Mercer. "You just arrested the mayor of Lexington." The station fell into absolute silence. Several officers stopped what they were doing. Someone swore under their breath. Mercer's jaw tightened. "I was just..." Daniels held up a hand. "Enough!" His voice was calm but sharp. He turned back to Alvarez. "Get those cuffs off." She moved quickly, unlocking the restraints. The second they were off, David rolled his wrists, shaking out the lingering ache. Mercer refused to look at him. Daniels exhaled, then fixed his stare on Mercer. "My office. Now." Mercer hesitated but obeyed, stalking toward the hallway, fists clenched at his sides. Daniels turned back to David. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize for this." David met his gaze, his voice measured. "Apologies don't change the fact that it happened." Daniels nodded slowly. "No, they don't." David straightened his suit jacket, adjusting his cuffs like a man regaining control. "I expect a full explanation," he said. "And I expect it tonight." Daniels didn't flinch. "You'll have it." David glanced around the room. Some officers looked away. Others met his gaze, their expressions unreadable. This wasn't just about one bad cop. This was about something bigger, and he wasn't about to let it slide. David Carter sat in Lieutenant Ray Daniels' office, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs, though the physical discomfort was the least of his concerns. His mind was sharpened with fury, but his expression remained composed. He had spent years in politics, mastering the art of keeping emotions in check, even when faced with blatant abuse of power. Across from him, Daniels leaned forward, elbows on his desk, rubbing his temples as if trying to make sense of the mess in front of him. The tension in the room was suffocating. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. "Come in," Daniels said. The door swung open, and Officer Jake Mercer stepped inside. His jaw was tight, his posture rigid, but there was no trace of the smug confidence he'd carried earlier that night. He knew what was coming. Daniels gestured for him to sit. Mercer hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering himself into the chair beside David. He didn't look at him. Daniels exhaled. "Officer Mercer, let's start with the basics. Why did you pull over Mayor Carter?" Mercer shifted slightly in his seat. He was hugging the center line. "I initiated a routine stop to make sure everything was in order." David let out a small, incredulous chuckle. "The center line?" Daniels shot him a glance, a silent request for patience, before turning back to Mercer. "And after that?" He seemed tense. "I wanted to make sure he wasn't under the influence or carrying anything illegal." Daniel's fingers tapped against the desk. "Did he slur his words? Smell of alcohol? Show any signs of impairment?" Mercer hesitated. Daniels leaned in. "Did you have probable cause to search his vehicle?" Mercer clenched his jaw. "I thought..." "You thought what?" Daniel's voice remained calm, but the weight behind his words was heavy. "I thought I should check," Mercer said, his voice quieter now. Daniel sat back. "So, no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, just a gut feeling?" David crossed his arms. "And when you ran my ID and realized exactly who I was, what happened then?" Mercer finally turned to look at him, his eyes narrowing. "I followed protocol." David let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "Protocol? You saw my name and instead of admitting your mistake, you escalated it." Mercer's hands curled into fists on his lap. "I detained you because there were discrepancies in your record." Daniel's eyes flicked to Mercer. "Let's talk about that. Alvarez ran his name in the system. There were no discrepancies. So either our entire database is broken, or you just made that up." Mercer's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. Daniel stared him down, then shook his head. "You know what the worst part is? The arrogance. You could have just admitted the mistake. Instead, you doubled down." Mercer's face reddened, but he held his ground. "I was doing my job." Daniels let out a slow breath, nodding slightly, as if he had finally come to a decision. He reached for a folder on his desk and flipped it open. "Effective immediately, Officer Mercer. You are placed on administrative leave, pending a full internal investigation." David leaned forward slightly, watching Mercer's reaction. The officer stiffened. "You're suspending me? For what?" Daniels raised a brow. "For what? How about unlawful detention? Abuse of authority? Wasting department resources?" He shook his head. "And frankly, I should be considering a termination recommendation. But let's take it one step at a time." Mercer shot up from his chair, his face red. "This is bullshit. I was following the rules." David stood up, smoothing out his sleeves. "No, Mercer. You were playing God with your badge, and you got caught." Mercer's mouth opened, but whatever retort he had died on his lips. Daniels turned to him. "Turn in your badge and gun before you leave tonight. You'll be notified about the hearing." Mercer looked between them, chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Then, with one final glare at David, he stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The silence left behind was deafening. Daniels sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "I can't apologize enough for this, Mr. Carter." David studied him carefully. Daniels wasn't like Mercer. He wasn't making excuses. He knew the weight of what had happened. "An apology isn't enough," David said. "Something like this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Mercer didn't create the problem. He's just a symptom of it." Daniels nodded slowly. "I don't disagree. David took a step closer. Then let's talk about solutions. Because if you think I'm just going to walk away from this and let it go, you're gravely mistaken. Daniels let out a long breath and gestured toward the seat. All right, Mayor, let's talk. That evening, the Lexington Community Center was packed. Residents filled every seat, lining the walls when chairs ran out. Some held signs reading, "Justice for all," and "End racial profiling now." Others wore expressions of anger, skepticism, or cautious hope. David stood at the podium, the weight of their expectations heavy on his shoulders. "Good evening, Lexington," he began, scanning the faces before him. "I stand before you not just as your mayor, but as someone who, just last night, experienced what too many of you already know: that justice in this city isn't always applied equally." A murmur ran through the crowd. David continued, "If I hadn't been the mayor, if cameras hadn't been rolling, who's to say how that stop would have ended?" A voice called out from the back, "It happens to us all the time." David nodded. "And that's exactly why we're here. Not just to talk about what happened to me, but to talk about what's been happening in this city for years. The question isn't just what we do about Jake Mercer. It's what we do about a system that allows this to keep happening." Applause rippled through the audience, but others still looked skeptical. Chief Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mayor Carter, I understand your concerns, and I assure you, we take this very seriously. We're conducting a full review." David turned to him. "With respect, Chief, a review isn't enough. We need action, starting now." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. A young woman in the audience stood up, Lisa Ramirez, a local activist. "What about a civilian oversight board? We've been asking for one for years." David nodded. "I support that. A civilian-led board to oversee police misconduct cases with real authority." Chief Holloway hesitated. "That's a complex policy shift. It would require council approval." Councilman Greg Wilkes, a longtime opponent of police reform, leaned forward. "And let's not rush into things just because of one high-profile incident. We need to hear from the department. Consider the budget." Boos rang out. Someone shouted, "This isn't just one incident." David gripped the podium. "With all due respect, Councilman, waiting means more people get pulled over, searched, arrested for nothing. We've waited long enough." A middle-aged black man stood up, Tom Bennett, a lifelong Lexington resident. His voice was steady, but his hands shook slightly. "I've lived in this city for 40 years. I've been stopped more times than I can count. My son was pulled out of his car at 16 because he fit a description. This isn't about budgets. It's about whether men like me and my boy can drive home without wondering if we'll make it home at all." David turned back to the officials seated behind him. "You hear that? That's the real issue, and that's why I'm calling for 3 immediate steps. A civilian oversight board with power to hold officers accountable, mandatory bias training for all officers, stronger disciplinary policies for officers who abuse their power. I will be submitting these proposals to the council tomorrow. No more delays, no more excuses." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Wilkes leaned over to Holloway, whispering something. The police chief looked tense but didn't object. Lisa Ramirez stepped forward. "And if they don't pass it?" David's eyes scanned the crowd, then landed on the dozens of phones recording, the reporters scribbling furiously, the people hungry for change. "Then we fight," he said simply. The room roared with agreement. Tonight wasn't just about him, it was about all of them, and the fight was far from over. The morning after the public forum, City Hall was buzzing with a mix of excitement and tension. Some council members had publicly supported David Carter's proposals, while others, like Greg Wilkes, had been evasive, insisting that the issues required further study. David sat in his office scrolling through news articles. Headlines dominated every outlet. Lexington mayor calls for police reform after his own wrongful arrest. The Lexington Post, civilian oversight board gains momentum amid public outcry. Channel 5 News. Divided council debates law enforcement accountability, Capital Gazette. He knew this was just the beginning of the battle. The public was engaged now, but would they stay engaged once the news cycle moved on? Angela Reed walked in, a folder in her hands. The council meeting's in an hour. Looks like we'll have 7 votes in favor, 3 against, and 1 undecided. David looked up. Who's the holdout? Angela sighed. Councilwoman Deborah Lively. She's getting pressure from the police union, worried about unintended consequences of the oversight board. David nodded. Get her on the phone. I want to talk to her before the meeting. Angela gave him a knowing look. You planning to persuade her? He met her gaze. I just want her to understand what's at stake. By the time David walked into the packed council chamber, the tension in the air was thick. Protesters lined the steps outside. Reporters filled the back of the room. Council President Elaine Foster banged the gavel. We are here to vote on 3 reform measures introduced by Mayor Carter. She read them aloud. A civilian oversight board with disciplinary authority over misconduct cases, mandatory bias training for all officers, stronger disciplinary policies for abuse of power. The floor is open for final comments, Foster said. Councilman Greg Wilkes leaned into his microphone. Look, nobody supports police misconduct, but this oversight board, it's unnecessary bureaucracy. Our police already have internal reviews. From the crowd, someone shouted, "Those don't work!" Wilkes ignored it. And these disciplinary measures? They'll make it harder for good officers to do their jobs. We're punishing the entire force for the actions of one man. David tapped his microphone, his voice measured but firm. With all due respect, Councilman, this isn't just about one man. This is about a system that allowed it to happen in the first place. Applause rippled through the audience. David turned toward the council. This isn't anti-police. This is about accountability. Officers who do their jobs with integrity, who serve this city with honor, should want this just as much as we do. He looked across the table at Deborah Lively. Councilwoman, you said you were concerned about unintended consequences. But let's talk about the consequences of doing nothing. Because if we refuse to act, we're sending a message that what happened to me, what happens to so many others, is acceptable. Lively shifted in her seat, avoiding his gaze. David leaned forward. If the system worked, I wouldn't have been handcuffed in the back of a squad car last night. And if I weren't mayor, you wouldn't even be hearing about it. The chamber fell silent. Council President Foster nodded. Let's proceed to the vote. One by one, names were called. Councilman Wilkes? No. Councilwoman Lively? A pause, then, yes. Angela exhaled sharply beside David. The final count, 8-3. Motion passes, Foster announced. The chamber erupted into cheers. David allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Later that evening, David stood outside the Lexington Police Department, watching officers file in and out. His driver was waiting, but he wasn't ready to leave just yet. You looking for something, Mayor? David turned. Lieutenant Ray Daniels stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. Not looking, David said. Just thinking. Daniels nodded, stepping closer. Heard about the vote? David studied him. How's the department taking it? Daniels let out a slow breath. Mixed. Some think Mercer deserved worse. Others? They think he was thrown under the bus. David nodded. He had expected as much. Change didn't come easy. You made some enemies today, Daniels said. David smirked. Wouldn't be my first time, Daniels chuckled. Then after a beat, he turned serious. You really think this is gonna fix things? David looked past him toward the station, the same building where Mercer had led him in handcuffs just days ago. This vote doesn't fix anything, he admitted, but it starts something. Daniels nodded slowly. Fair enough. He extended a hand. David shook it. Be careful, Mayor, Daniels said. You just kicked a hornet's nest. David smirked. Good. Maybe it's time some people got stung. David sat alone in his office. The city skyline stretched out before him. The vote had passed. The first steps were taken. But the real fight? That was still ahead. The police union would resist. Some council members would drag their feet. Others would actively try to undo what had been passed. And yet, change had begun. He picked up his phone, scrolled through his emails. Among the messages from politicians, activists, and reporters, one stood out. From Tom Bennett. Subject: Thank you. David opened it. I've lived in this city for 40 years. Last night was the first time I felt like someone in power was actually listening. Keep fighting. We've got your back. David exhaled slowly. Then he typed a reply. I will. He hit send. Then as the city lights flickered outside his window, he got back to work.